Check the mic and make sure it sound right, boys.
2, 1. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to a new episode of The Arrow. First, before we start the podcast, I would like to say that please like, share, and subscribe our channel and help us grow an ecosystem where we learn and get motivated from some of the most interesting people who are amongst us. Today's podcast is about one of my favorite subjects, and that is history. To be honest, I was never interested in history while I was in school, because it was all about passing the exams. And when I took up engineering, I never looked back at that subject. But later when I grew up, I got interested in stories. But even if all the stories in the world are put together, they will still fall short in front of the stories of our entire past. And so I started searching for various stories about the past, which is also known as history. I got all the information I needed about Greeks, Romans, and the Native Americans. But when I wanted to know about Indian subcontinent history specifically, I was a little bit disappointed because it was so less and not much detailed, apart from a few periods from our history. So when I started this podcast, I already had decided that I will call a historian and ask him the questions which I always wanted to know. And Mr. Anirudh, hi, Mr. Anirudh, and he's that person whose research made me reach out to him. His work is so nuanced about our past that it makes you know even more. He's a young man and who is doing research in the history of the Indian subcontinent. So, Anirudh, I would like to welcome you on The Arrow. I know you have zillion times information in your head that I would like to know, but today in this episode, we will just touch the basics because as I said, we are away from history from last 15, 16 years. But before we do that, I would like you to tell me about you, your background, and the works you have done till now.
Okay, well, we begin by thanking you, Varun, and you, Abhimanyu, and Naveen. Thank you all so much for having me on The Arrow today. I'm also, like all of you, an engineer. I did like history while I was in school, though that's a little bit of a difference. And the reason I liked it was because most of my exposure to history was not because of exams, but rather because of video games. So I was a massive Age of Empires fan. I also used to play a lot of Rome Total War. And once you start seeing history in that way, once you actually see there's an interesting side to it, and you can actually enjoy history without worrying about learning the dates of rulers and so on. You start to see it in some slightly different ways. Now, of course, that didn't mean that I could really pursue history as a career because, of course, I'm a South Indian guy. Therefore, when I was born, it was preordained that I should go into engineering. But it was actually during engineering college that I went through a similar journey that you described, Varun, where I started to I got interested in just generally reading about histories of particular regions. And since I came from a background where I was playing games about Greece and Rome, I started off by reading about Greece and Rome. There was so much material online. I found it absolutely fascinating. And then I started wondering about Indian history, and again, I had the exact same problem where I was just not able to find good material about it. I would buy books, but I would find them to be very academic, very dry. But I had nothing but time on my hands because my college rather uniquely didn't have an attendance requirement. So I didn't really have to go to class. So I spent an awful lot of time just reading and reading and reading. So I would actually pick up books dedicated to particular time periods, particular regions in India, and kind of get myself to read them systematically. And I also picked up a general interest in kind of understanding where India fit into the broader flow of global history, right? Which is something that isn't really talked about a lot in school. But since I came from a background where I read about Greek and Roman history, I was always looking for connections to see where India kind of plugged into that. After leaving engineering college, I knew that engineering really wasn't it for me. So I worked in analytics for a while. But my job wasn't really a lot of fun. I was basically copying and pasting stuff from one Excel sheet to another. So I ended up moving to public policy. And it was in that process, I'd studied a little bit of economics and so on in college because I needed electives where I could get really good grades because my engineering grades were absolutely terrible. And so I joined a public policy program, which covered like a whole bunch of interesting topics, including economics. And one of the assignments that we had was to give an example of price controls from anywhere in the world. Now, we Indians are most familiar with price controls because, every time something is too expensive, the government usually steps in and puts in a price control, whether or not it makes any economic sense. The fact that, in Tamil Nadu, for example, there are price caps on tickets is a great example. I give an example of Alauddin Khilji's price control system in Delhi in the 14th century, which from historical record seems to have been by far the most expansive, the most successful system of price controls, which controlled the price of everything from camels to carpets. It actually worked for a few decades. Of course, it was a highly violent system, but it actually worked. And my evaluators, the guys who were teaching me the course, were very impressed because not a lot of people generally think of like taking these economic principles and applying them to the past. And they told me as much. And then it occurred to me that like, maybe I have something interesting to say after all when it comes to history. And maybe history can be something that I potentially do more with. So I did a course on this platform called Unacademy, which is an exam preparation website on history. And when I made the course, my whole approach to it was that Indian history is not boring. It is the most bloody interesting thing that anybody in the Indian subcontinent can ever read. Because as you were saying again, right? So it is stranger than fiction. The sheer scale of it and the absolute mad stuff that happens in India's past really, really requires deeper appreciation. You can't do that if you're just lost in this endless list of, oh, this king did that, and then that king did this. Once you start looking at these tides of cultures emerging and societies changing, it changes the way that you see history and changes the way that you see yourself and where you fit into all of that. And I really wanted to bring that across in my Unacademy course. So the way that I chose to do that was through using visuals. There was almost no text on the slides that I used. I would use almost no dates or ruler names. And I would focus instead just on using pictures of art from various historical periods. So the end result really was that I created this 5-hour course, which basically showed you how India looked, in a sense, from the 3rd century BC or so, all the way to the present day, through the evolution of art. Eventually, I ended up leaving my analytics job. I ended up getting into public policy full-time. And through sheer luck, honestly, it just so happened that the place where I was working, the Takshila Institution, happened to have connections with IVM Podcasts, who are a really amazing production firm based in Mumbai. And I pitched a history podcast idea to them, partially because somebody made a bet with me in an office meeting that I couldn't do. And I just looked around and realized there's no good Indian history podcasts out there. There are like a couple that talk about Indian history, but they're usually not really made by Indians, so they don't even get the pronunciation of basic words like Magadha correctly. They say Magada, for example, which is just so weird, right? Like, how is it that in a country of 1.3 billion people, such a huge history and such a rapidly growing podcast market, that nobody was using this platform to talk about our history in interesting ways? And so I set out to create the podcast that I wished had been created for Indian history. And I really try to lean into the podcast format to do that. You can do some very interesting stuff with audio, right? So for the very first episode of Echoes of India, for example, my first podcast, begins with Porus, this Indian king, actually standing at the banks of the Hydaspes or Jhelum River, watching Alexander. And the entire structure of this story was that very often we hear about this from the Greek perspective. We hear it from Alexander's perspective. But what would have been going on in Porus's mind? And how can you bring that to life with a podcast? You can actually put in the sound effects of elephants, of conch shells, of thunderstorms. And you can really create this visual image in your listener's mind. And there are so many interesting instances like that in history. Like, imagine, for example, what did the citizens of Gandhara feel when the Kushanas showed up through the Khyber Pass and basically conquered the city? How did they feel? You know, there are so many stories of princes murdering their fathers. Very often we're taught of that in this very matter-of-fact way. But really think about the psychology of the people who do things like that. What kind of family politics do they have? Like, we absolutely cannot imagine it. Like, can you imagine what your parents would have to do to you for you to want to kill them? Like, that's
exactly.
That's really messed up. And that's also really the thought process that led to my second podcast, Yuddha, the Indian military history podcast. Because once again, India's military history is not something that's talked about in podcast format. And it's a very interesting concept, and it's one that has a lot of political applications, if you will. Like, you see people constantly talking about XYZ battle, this side defeated that side. Therefore, these people are totally evil and we must persecute them today. But if you actually look at the reality of what went down in history, you realize that it's really a lot more complex than that. It's a lot more nuanced. And there are villains on both sides, to be honest. And in India in the 21st century, given how ancient our civilization is, given how populous our country is, and given that we have such aspirations to be a global power and we claim to be the world's largest democracy, we need to have a certain kind of maturity when it comes to talking about our history. We need to be able to have these more mature conversations. And that's really why I do my podcasting stuff. And that, of course, has led me to my final project, which is explicitly aimed to tackle this idea we have of histories being divided and separate from each other. And it's called Connected Histories. So that's a project that I do with a couple of friends on YouTube. And the explicit objective of that is to create history documentaries that explore India's connected history with the rest of the world. So we talk about stuff like how, for example, in the 16th century, far from stereotypes of Indians not being interested in scientific innovation, it was really Indians who were creating among the world's most sophisticated gunpowder weaponry, better even than what was being made in Germany and Bohemia. So if you go looking for that, Indian history is full of these fascinating examples. And I try to use digital tools, digital platforms to get these stories out to as many people as I potentially can. I've gone on for like far too long. Hope that's a good introduction to me.
No.
And why
I want you to go as long as you can, as long as you don't feel hungry and want to leave the podcast. I can listen to you all the time. I have watched your blogs. Read your blogs and watched your podcasts. And I think yesterday only you released declared that you are going to make a new channel with your friends. I think that's what you are. I follow you on Twitter too, and I have heard all your podcasts on IBM. I mean, it's a real quality stuff, and I will ask my viewers also here that whoever they are, that please follow Anirudh. And as I said, his research is quite nuanced, and those small things you will not get in. You will never get it in movies and TV series. First of all, you will get it in books maybe, and as I said, there are not many books. So follow this guy. He's going to places in future. I know that already. And second thing which I noticed about you is that you are very articulate about what you say. You don't say stuff which is like a filler thing. Every word you say is actually related to that part of story and actually related to the real things. So I really enjoy your work. And now, since you have said it, I just have one question, which is, it's a general question because your life started also as an engineer. A podcast made you get into history by all the life events which you had till now. So my question is that why is history not such a sort of glamorous subject? And everyone loves stories. Everyone loves to hear stories, read about them. But when history itself is the biggest story in this whole universe about everything, there are many characters, many parts, series, whatever you want to say. But why do nobody really wants to pursue history unless he doesn't get into engineering or become a doctor?
That's a great question. It's something that I have actually thought about a lot because it has so much application to my own life. And I think the simplest answer to that, especially in India, is the fact that history is not seen as a viable career path. And honestly, in a lot of ways, it simply isn't. What kind of jobs can a historian get? In India, perhaps you can get into academia. Perhaps if you're really lucky, you can get into heritage conservation. But you can also get into those same career paths by other means that are far more lucrative. So, for example, if you study architecture, you can be an actual architect and also get heritage conservation jobs, right? And especially, I think, if you look at the rest of the world, the reason why Europe and the US have these flourishing history industries is because the entire media ecosystem encourages people who have actual history degrees to get into the field of, for example, writing scripts for documentaries, acting as consultants on movies, to create graphic novels about history, for example. And people are far more willing to pay for stuff. So people are willing to pay for podcasts, for example. Dan Carlin is a great example, right? So he does this excellent series called Hardcore History, but you have to pay for the episodes. People are willing to pay for that because the production value that goes into it is really worth it. Now in India, the ecosystem is actually totally different in comparison, right? For the last few decades, especially, politicians have really called the shots in terms of what kind of histories are being told, because governments have so much control over academia. You sometimes can't really say things that are not politically expedient, for fear of not getting funding for your projects, for fear of being transferred to other places, that kind of thing. So that's one reason why historians can't really get into things with the same kind of depth they can the rest of the world. That's not to say that historical research doesn't happen in India. So if you look at, for example, Delhi University and JNU in Delhi, historians there have done some really excellent work over the last few decades. But the reason they're able to do that is because, well, they're sitting in the national capital and nobody can really mess with them that much. And so there's also a problem that due to the lack of historical career opportunities here in India, there is a brain drain in history as well, just like there's a brain drain in IT jobs. A lot of the brightest young Indian historians simply don't have enough opportunities in India, and therefore end up going and studying abroad and settling down into academic careers there. And the reason I know this is because, like, I myself am planning to go and get a degree. I've got an admission into the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, which thank you so much. But I'm not going to be taking it up this year because, pandemic is going on and all that. I'd rather be at home, honestly. I'm much more likely to have lucrative career opportunities if I'm settling in the UK. So just in general, the Indian history ecosystem and the media ecosystem also isn't very conducive to careers there. If you think about, for example, there's this obsession with creating interesting TV shows about ancient Rome, for example, that are full of blood and sex and that kind of thing. Now, you would imagine the Mauryan Empire is perfect for that kind of thing, right? India's first really quote-unquote global empire. These guys very clearly had a fascinating sense of time and place. They understand themselves as being the descendants of empires that are like hundreds of years old. And they're interested in reaching out to the world. You can imagine that you could tell some really interesting stories with blood and sex and everything. Really an Indian Game of Thrones. So until we have a system which encourages the free exchange of ideas, which is more mature in terms of the way that people think about and engage with history, and allows us to think that, okay, you know what, the past is a different world, and we live in a different world now, and we can learn from the mistakes of our past. It's going to be difficult for India's history ecosystem to be anywhere near the same amount of vibrancy and the sheer size that you have in Europe and the West. And that's really sad because there are so many stories that need to be told, but so many things need to be changed for us to reach a situation where we're able to really do justice to our past.
Actually, people always forget that history is not owned by anyone. It is there. It is there for you to learn from it, and even if you want to use some of the, like you said, that you used the Alauddin Khilji's economic pattern in your thesis. So, but when people start thinking that there is a possibility that they can change history because of some propaganda books or some different kinds of movies who are saying things from a different perspective, I totally understand that some groups are offended by those movies or those TV series. It's their perspective, but history is not owned by anyone, and everybody has the right to tell his or her own history, because there is one big saying or one common saying that whoever wins writes the history. Yeah. And when right now, when in this whole world there are quite less wars. We are at a very good place when we compare it to our own past as humans or Homo sapiens. We are at a very peaceful place. I think this is the right time when we see the history from all the perspectives. And if we see the history from all the perspectives, we will be uh, stopping another Hitler to be born, or not born, but another Hitler to be made in, and we can stop so many deaths and so many wars. Maybe many Afghanistan wars in the future are already stopped because people learned that these types of war in Middle East, they never end. They always last forever. But this is this is very recent history. But if we go back in time, the history is already quite muddied, and we have forgotten everything. And as you said that most of the historians of India or Indian subcontinent, not India, because at that time, whatever the British controlled, and even before that, the history is always from their perspective. They looked at us as a land they wanted to capture, and that's how they portrayed it. It's like how we will right now portray Britishers in movies like Lagan. So it will be always that way. But when people start owning history, I dislike it because it's very far from the truth. Let's directly get into the real history now. And what is the first thing I want to ask is the first thing after Adam and Eve. How did Homo sapiens started civilization? Because they were hunters and gatherers. We know about them. And after that, I think the definition of civilization is that when a people or a tribe starts cultivating crops or starts farming, that's when it is called or termed as a civilization. So how and why did Homo sapiens started that?
Well, honestly, the origins of civilization are hotly debated to this day. And it seems that every year there are new discoveries that further complicate the picture. So I'm going to lay out two potential ways that this could have happened. Now, one example that's put forth by the political scientist James C. Scott is that basically imagine that you're living in a very harsh land, and your tribe needs to use all potential means to survive in this harsh land. So, for example, you notice that a particular kind of plant grows very well in this land. As you're migrating around your territory every season, you start realizing that, okay, this plant has seeds. I'm going to take these seeds and I'm going to plant more and more of them. And I'm going to come back after a little while at the end of the season, I'm going to gather this. Now, James Scott says that sometime during this kind of process, one particular tribe or group of tribes, or perhaps groups of people across various parts of the world, roughly around the same time, realized that there is a lot more to be gained by keeping the tribes settled at one place, appointing one set of leaders to be in charge of ensuring that as much of these crops are produced, and using the surplus that is generated by this agricultural wealth to basically go to war with other settled down peoples. And through this violence really is how civilization originated. That's why very soon after civilization start, you see very thick walls emerging, partially to defend from external enemies, and also to make sure that the subjects of these chiefs and kings could stay within four walls and be tracked by the states that were beginning to emerge. So there's these salt marshes in Basra in modern Iraq, which is near the shore of the Persian Gulf. And these salt marshes were basically a gathering spot for people of tribes who had many different ways of getting food from the land. One group of them, for example, used to survive by catching fish from the salt marshes. Another group of people were migratory pastoralists, shepherds, who would come by the salt marshes every few seasons or so. And gradually, these people began to, as they would trade for food, the fishermen would trade for goats, the shepherds would trade for fish. They began to celebrate the bounty of nature every few seasons or so. And they began to realize that, look, maybe if we start celebrating religious festivals together, maybe if we start actually trying to work this hostile land together, if we build irrigation systems, for example, we start gathering fresh water, then we can actually profit a lot more from each other. And through this process, we see the emergence of possibly one of the very earliest human gods. For all three of you have heard of Capricorn, the astrological sign of a goat with a fish tail. So that's really where Capricorn originates from. It's from these ancient shepherds slash fishermen who created the syncretic god with both, who's both a divine goat and also a divine fish. And it's from this collaboration instead that you start to see systems of collective action emerging, that you start to see agriculture emerging, and from there that you start to see states and religions and so on emerging. So there's two radically different interpretations of very similar kind of evidence. And honestly, we might never have a definitive explanation. I guess really what you think about the origins of human civilization tells you a lot about how you think civilization emerged afterwards. You can see it as primarily about the state trying to control and dominate its people. Or you can see it instead as mostly the story of people who are just trying to get by with their lives and do what is good for their families, and in the process accidentally creating systems that have really world-changing consequences. And honestly, there really is no single right answer. Like a lot of things in history, these kind of questions are really complicated.
Anirudh, I was thinking that there is one theory which suggests that at certain point of the end of Homo sapiens, the evolution of Homo sapiens, we started cultivating crops. But if I want to think about it, I think the evolution might be happening after we started cultivating the crops. What do you think? I know it's evolution history, it's sort of part of the biology, but I just wanted to know your thoughts about it.
Well, I think the genetic evidence is fairly certain about the fact that humans had finished evolving into basically biologically modern humans well before agriculture emerged. The thing is that systematic agriculture, the way that Homo sapiens does it, especially modern Homo sapiens, is fairly recent. And the reason we know is because, again, of the archaeological record. We can tell from our remains, the remains of our ancestors, what kind of foods they were eating. And in general, the further back in history you go, you will see humans that are clearly hunter-gatherers that have a very wide and varied diet, where they're eating stuff that comes from a wide variety of places. And it's only relatively recently that you see humans trying to settle down in one place and have a fairly limited kind of agricultural diet. And both of these, there's this hunter-gatherer, the traces of hunter-gatherer diets are visible in the fossil record way before agriculture shows up. So my personal view is that it's fairly certain that agriculture is something that we invented after we'd finished evolving.
I see.
Great. So hearing you, and then we heard a lot about this Homo sapiens and then civilizations. You have explained well what was the need of the being civilized and how people have developed this. But since we are here with the Indian history podcaster, I would like to know about how human civilization in India, where was the first sign of its establishment and why it was there, why it wasn't somewhere else or something. So if you can put your thoughts on this.
Okay, so in general, let me just say for all of your listeners that prehistory and this area is not generally something that I know too much about. I have read a little bit about it, so I can tell you to the best of my knowledge. But I think when we get into the ancient and medieval India sections is when I'm really going to be very confident about what I'm going to say. So as per my best understanding, really the earliest traces of human civilization in the Indian subcontinent emerge roughly in the Balochistan region of all places, where we start to see these small little settlements that are already at this very early time trading with very distant farmers all the way away in Iran, for example. And you see these beautiful little huts and pits that contain the remains of what these people were eating. And gradually it seems that these and it's kind of debatable as to why we see it originating in this relatively hostile terrain rather than in a fertile river valley, for example. And I think it ties into the two examples that I was presenting earlier, where it's really in these very hostile circumstances that humans develop these systems of collective action that is required for agriculture and for very complex societies. And gradually it seems that these people began to move towards the Indus River Valley. And there began to like really experiment with some pretty amazing kind of systems of settlement. You see very, very sophisticated irrigation systems, very, very sophisticated hydraulic engineering, really. And what is really fascinating to me about the Indus civilization is that for most of its history, it is the most populous of all human civilizations. And by its peak, the Indus civilization had 1,500 cities compared to like barely a few hundred in Mesopotamia and barely a few dozen in, say, China and Egypt. And it had a population of 5 million, which is multiple times that you'd find in any other part of the world. So at one point in human history, the subcontinent was home to the vast majority of humans. And very interestingly, this mature Harappan phase, which is the most urban period of the Indus civilization, emerges after this very interesting clue in the archaeological record where a lot of Indus cities seem to have been burnt to the ground. And then all of a sudden, on top of these ashes, you see these beautiful, well-planned cities emerging. And you really have to think about what really went down. Well, was there some kind of violent revolution, for example, that was like, in with the new and out with the old, end up destroying all these old cities and came up with this radically new system with these very egalitarian cities where homes are all relatively the same size, where if you look at the kind of grave goods that we find in Indus graves, the wealthiest Indus person we've ever found buried was buried with 70 pots. 70 pots. Compare that to the wealthiest Egyptian or the wealthiest like Mesopotamian who's ever buried. Like those guys had like dozens, hundreds of slaves buried with them. These insanely luxurious like textiles and carpentry and gold items and perfumes that most of the subjects could never even have imagined. And yet somehow in the Indus civilization, after this violent revolution, it seems to have been wonderfully egalitarian for quite a few centuries, and people got along surprisingly well until, of course, climate change and disease and so on led to the civilization eventually declining. It's really fascinating. I wish that I knew more about the period and I could answer your question better. And I honestly wish that the Indus script had been deciphered so we knew more about like who these fascinating people were and how they thought of themselves. Because honestly, you cannot understand the history of the Bronze Age. You cannot understand the origins of human history without understanding the Indus civilization. And this applies more generally to Indian history as well. Like it is very surprising to me that global histories very often don't bother with getting too deep into what happened in the Indian subcontinent. And we are also not trained to think of the fact that really our history is as connected to the rest of the world as any other part of the world. Either you go to this extreme where people think that, oh, we taught the world everything and, nobody ever taught us anything and we were the most culturally sophisticated. Or you go to the other extreme and they're like, no, we weren't interested in doing anything outside. We were just like backwards people and we had all these problems and we never wanted to learn until we were violently conquered. Both of them are extremes. The reality lies somewhere in between. And the reality is far more exciting, really, than either one of those extremes. So I really don't understand why we are not able to think and just see the clear patterns that show us just how interesting our history was instead of projecting these various colonial hangovers that we have about our past onto it.
Yeah, I think as you have explained earlier also, since as an Indian, we don't have many Indian scholars also. And when these foreigners comes, they see the Indian history from very overall perspective. They don't go in depth. I mean, that could be the one reason, I guess. Yeah, Varun.
Yeah, I can't tell you how much it annoys me when I go to Hampi, for example, and there's a lot of tourists who come there from the West, but they are not there because they know anything about the city of Vijayanagara or the fact that it was larger than Paris at one point. They're just there because, hey, man, we're just here for the brownies, we're just here for the herbs, That's such a tragedy. That's such an absolute tragedy. This is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. This should be covered in museums. It should be covered in like facilities that allow you to experience Hampi as it used to be. But it's reduced to a little more than a place where Israeli soldiers can come there after being demobbed to like hang out in India for like a few months, and that's really sad. It shows you how little, like for all that our politicians have been saying for all these decades about protecting our heritage and our history, it's all simply a scam to get votes. And it's really sad. It's really sad.
Anirudh, while you were saying things about how the civilization started, I just got a question in my mind, and it is that there is one theory, and the authenticity of it, maybe you will tell me. And there is a theory that first humans, they came from, I think, South Africa to Indian Peninsula, the first time. And
Yep.
what are your thoughts about, or have you done some reading about this theory? I do not actually know. There are many theories about the first people, humans coming from Africa to Indian subcontinent.
So I think the consensus really is not South Africa, or more like East Central Africa, roughly the Kenya, Ethiopia region is probably the place where modern Homo sapiens really evolved. And yeah, I mean, I have read a little bit about it. I'd highly recommend David Reich's excellent book, Who We Are and How We Got Here, which dives a lot into the genetic evidence and like really what it tells us of the way that humans spread. And it is absolutely fascinating. Like, we are talking about like within a few generations, essentially Homo sapiens spreading out to every corner of the world. They're going along the coast of India, down along the coast of Southeast Asia, following the coastline all the way up to the Bering Strait, crossing into North America, and then getting all the way down to South America. The reason we know this is because if you look at the genetic evidence, you look at the DNA of human fossils, you can observe the things. You can look at the mitochondrial, which is directly passed down from and Y chromosome DNA, which is from father to son. And of course, yeah, from father to son. So there are various tools by which you can estimate how much genome is changing with every single generation, right? Because every time a child is born, genes of the parents are slightly mutated in order to basically create a new zygote. You can estimate roughly how many generations it took for the DNA of a particular group of humans to change based on how the maternal population's DNA is changing, how much the paternal population's DNA is changing. And it's through these kind of where humans are coming from, where they're going. And from all accounts, it must have been a pretty extraordinary story. When Homo sapiens were first emerging into the broader landmass of Eurasia, there were also other human species who were alive on Earth at the time. We know that Homo sapiens were interacting with Denisovans, with Neanderthals, even with Homo erectus, if I'm not wrong. And you really have to think, like, how did these other lost human species shape our early religions, our early cultures? Our very genes today are really determined by the legacy of these lost stories and connections. It must have been an absolutely fascinating story, and also a very difficult life, of course, for our ancestors. We've come such a long way, really, in the last few thousand years. It really boggles my mind to think of the scale of all these great tidal movements of populations.
There's no doubt that when we talk about the origin and the age of Indian civilization, the topic becomes very controversial. So you told few things related to Indus Valley civilization, and I further want to know more about the information related to Indus Valley civilization and how old is Indus Valley civilization according to archaeology particularly, and were they related to Aryans, or is it just a myth?
Okay, so that's very interesting, and of course, even though it's a question that's been answered by science, it still remains a political dynamite to weigh in on this question. But I can tell you what the scientific record tells us, and of course, people are free to form their own conclusions. So really, the peak of the Indus Valley civilization is around 2500 BC, so that's nearly 4,500, 5,000 years ago. It is one of the Bronze Age civilizations, contemporary with Mesopotamia, with Egypt, and the early civilizations on the Yellow River in China. And in terms of the social structure, the economy of the Indus people, like, we can make some conclusions. Right? They're obviously a very urban people. We have not really found a lot of evidence of temples in any Indus cities. We haven't really found a lot of evidence of sacrificial altars, for example. Now, if you look at the Rig Veda, the composers of the Rig Veda call themselves Aryas, the noble ones. And the kind of culture that they're aware of is not really a very urban culture. They are talking about living in groups of tribes. They're talking about going around stealing herds from each other. So they're very clearly a pastoral people who aren't that very well aware of agriculture, irrigation, and that kind of thing. So that's one piece of evidence suggesting that the Aryans and the Indus people are not the same. Another piece of evidence, of course, comes from the genetics, really. And if you look at the DNA of the Indus Valley people, the maternal DNA is very similar to the maternal DNA of modern Indians, but the paternal DNA is really quite different. And it's related to paternal DNA that we see in Central Asia and Iran, and that we also see as far away as, for example, Greece, Italy, and all the way to Spain, for example. That's another piece of evidence. Clearly, there is another group of people spreading across very, very wide areas. The third piece of evidence is this very interesting drug called the Soma drug, which is constantly mentioned in the Rig Veda. Now, the Soma seems to have been some kind of plant with stalks that gave out a white juice. And if you look at the later Vedic period, when the Upanishads are being composed and the Aryas are mostly settled down in the middle Gangetic plains, they say that Soma is difficult to get their hands on. They have to import it at great distances. Whereas in the Rig Veda, Soma is something that they are very easily able to get their hands on. And very interestingly, if you look at the Avesta, one of the earliest Zoroastrian texts, that also mentions a plant called the Hauma. It mentions Daivas as essentially the enemies of the Zoroastrian gods. Whereas in comparison, the Daivas are the divinities of the Aryas. So it seems to me really that there's some evidence to show that, look, clearly there was one group of people that separated, went into Iran, went into India. Both of them initially had the Soma plant. It was part of their religious rituals. And later on, it evolved in different ways. And the final argument, of course, is in terms of the linguistic evidence. If you look at Latin words like ignis, for example, you see they're related to Sanskrit words like Agni, right? So the ancestor of these languages must have been the very same thing. And on balance, if you look at the way the time periods over which these languages are evolving, if you look at when and where the genetic evidence of these new kind of paternal DNA is kind of coming into Indian subcontinent emerged, I think on balance, the weight and the scientific consensus is in favor of the Aryas being a different people from the Indus Valley people and having arrived roughly around the time when the Indus people were declining. Now, whether these guys were actually going to war, I think is really debatable. The British, of course, since they had such a penchant for making up stories that justified their rule over India, were all big proponents of this Aryan invasion theory, essentially of these fair-skinned people coming and conquering the dark-skinned Indians, which is a racist and bullshit theory. Let's be clear about that. But the evidence that we see reveals that a migration certainly did happen. And in our haste to kind of dismiss the British for the terrible history that they left for us, we should not allow it to blind us to what modern science is also telling us, that yes, there was a migration that happened. And even if these people did migrate, it did not take very long for them to merge into the population of the Indian subcontinent. Within a few generations, the Aryas, who are these pastoral people, become farmers, just like the indigenous people of the subcontinent. And very obviously, there was some influence from the indigenous religions and cultures on the Aryas themselves. So from a very early time, India has always been this very multi-ethnic and very multicultural kind of land. And just like it has been through the rest of history. So I think that's something that, at least personally, is something that I firmly believe in. I know that there's a lot of political controversy on it, but I feel that the political controversy is mostly manufactured and it doesn't really engage very deeply with the facts.
As we are talking about the Indus Valley civilization and its demise of the Indus Valley, and then you are telling the Aryans migrated from and settled in the Indian subcontinent. After that, if I understand, after Indus Valley civilization, there was another, we can say another civilizations which developed. And if I talk about the Indian empires, we have heard a lot about the Roman Empire, as you have also discussed previously, and Greek Empire, and so many we have in history. But what was the first biggest empire in the India that time? Because in my knowledge, I don't read much, but I have seen some TV series like Chandragupta Maurya or some other TV series. But I do not have much information about these empires. So what can you put your thoughts in that?
So the long story short is that as these people are beginning to move deeper into the Gangetic plains, they begin to settle down. They start to get more interest in agriculture. Gradually, their culture becomes more complex. Societies become more complex. Agrarian output starts to increase. As a result, we gradually see cities emerging. And from these cities, gradually they become city-states. You start to see kingdoms emerging. And there's a competition really between a lot of major kind of coalitions of tribes and kingdoms that emerge across the Gangetic plains, roughly starting from 800 BC or so. But there's one particular region towards the east of this entire, the easternmost edge really of all the Janapadas, this region of Magadha. And Magadha is it has an amazing geographical position because it's very close to the Chota Nagpur plateau. So it can draw on very valuable minerals. It can constantly manufacture arms and weaponry, for example, and it can also get its hands on elephants. And I think that really this is an idea that was first proposed by the great academic Thomas Trautmann. He thinks that it was Magadha's access to elephants and its innovations in terms of the use of war elephants that allowed it to very quickly militarily dominate the other Mahajanapadas, the other kingdoms of the Gangetic plains. So it really starts with the dynasty, I think, called the Haryankas. So you see this chap called Bimbisara and his son Ajatashatru, who are very major figures in Buddhist and Jain scriptures, which is very interesting, right? Because you simultaneously have a time when you have these great thinkers and these revolutionary religions emerging, but at the same time, you're starting to see these very revolutionary states emerging that have these very well-trained armies that are maintained at the expense of the king, that have these very sophisticated administrative structures. And it's from this nucleus that Magadha first begins to conquer Koshala, which is just a little further up along the Gangetic plains. And then gradually, of course, there's a lot of political turbulence that happens in Magadha itself. But by the time that the Nanda dynasty emerges, the many kingdoms and polities of the Gangetic plains have been dominated by this single kind of Gangetic plains spanning empire, the Magadhan Empire. Very often, like a lot of us have heard of the Mauryas, for example. Think of the Mauryas as the first Indian empire, but they're really not. The Nandas are the first Indian empire. They're the first guys to really dominate the Gangetic plains. And who really are these Nandas? Again, like it's hard not to see these parallels with Greece and Rome, right? If you look at both Greece and Rome, you see inevitably that even if the aristocracy starts off with these ideas in a war, inevitably it's the most capable soldiers, the most battle-hardened veterans who end up taking over the reins of the state and the society and essentially becoming tyrants and dictators. And it seems that was roughly what the Nandas also did. They are men who come from below. If you look at the Buddhist texts, they're basically mocked as men who are of very low caste, for the children of barbers, for example, and who rise up to the top. Now, the truth of the matter, we will probably never know. But if you look at the way that these guys rise to power, and then the way that they go on to consolidate their power, it's very reminiscent of any like Roman emperor, for example. When you come to the throne, you want to keep the people of your capital city happy. So you go and you just go and try to conquer whatever other people that you can get your hands on, enslave them, take their wealth and bring it back to your city. That's what the Nandas do. They're the first guys to actually go and try and conquer Odisha, not the Mauryas. Soon after, eventually, when they're overthrown, the Mauryas come to the throne. What do the Mauryas do? The exact same thing. They also are people who seem to come from lowly backgrounds, and they go on through these aggressive military campaigns to kind of consolidate their power in their home base. That's why they're out there in Punjab conquering. Like before that, no Magadhan polity had any interest in the Punjab. That's why you suddenly see them all the way in Afghanistan. You see them all the way in Odisha. You see them all the way in the Deccan. You see them coming all the way down to the borders of the Tamil country. They're not doing this because they want to establish a national level democratic political party. They're doing this because they want to conquer. They're doing this because they want loot. And they're not doing it out of the need to enlighten or civilize any of these other peoples. They're doing it because they think they're better. They want to integrate them into their imperial system, into their economic system. So if you look at the archaeological evidence, if you look at the literary evidence, it seems that this early Gangetic empires were fairly sophisticated in terms of their administrative structures, in terms of their organization, in terms of the social, economic, political complexity. And they used their overwhelming population to kind of dominate the other regions of the subcontinent. It might not seem like the most pleasant way for Indian civilizations and urban centers to start out, but because as a result of this, you start to see many new polities emerging in the aftermath of the Mauryas, who are taking inspiration from how the Mauryas did things, and again, going out and trying to do these territorial conquests. You see the Satavahanas, for example, in the Deccan, who seem to have been subjugated by the Mauryas and then learn from the Mauryas and then go on to build their own Deccan empire. So that's the long and short of it. The single earliest and largest empire are the empires of the Gangetic Plains, and they are the earliest to really properly urbanize in the subcontinent, but they also deliver this impetus to the rest of the subcontinent also to get into this whole urbanization, conquest, and civilization game.
Anirudh, how these empires influence the culture of Indian subcontinent, if we talk about the culture particularly?
So, like I mentioned a little earlier, right? It's very interesting that we see these revolutionary thinkers like Buddha and Mahavira emerging around the same time as these early empires do. And I'm pretty sure if Buddha were to see the Sarnath Stupa and to see the kind of rituals that people are enacting around his remains and going on in circles, he would have laughed and laughed until his heart burst. Like, this is a guy who explicitly said that I am not a god. Don't take me seriously. Don't take any teacher seriously. Question everything. And then within a few generations after his death, he's transformed into a divinity. And not just any divinity, an imperial divinity. This guy, like, just imagine what you would have thought of this, of Ashoka Maurya. One of the, and let's face it, like Ashoka in his early career was a very successful and very bloody and violent warlord. To see this guy associating himself with Buddha's religion and appointing himself as, essentially the dispenser of morality and moral lectures to the entire subcontinent, saying that I'm uplifting all of you to the Buddha's Dhamma. What would Buddha have thought of that, man? Like, it's really weird to think about, So that's how these early empires influence Indian culture.
So, let's start again. I think probably you all must be seeing that the backgrounds have changed, and I think we should get a Guinness Book Award or something that we are recording one podcast in 2 episodes, spanning one more week. So let's see. Okay, Abhimanyu, you can continue with the last question.
As we are talking about the empires, and we have also discussed that there are many biggest empires which are mostly talked, like Roman Empire, Greek empires. But here I would like to ask, in a context of Indian history, from an Indian podcaster, what was the biggest empire in Indian subcontinent?
Well, the simple answer to that is the Mughal Empire. Like, by far the largest, by far the most expansive, the most populous, military, economic, social juggernaut. Because it gets quite a bit of a bad rap in modern politics, partially due to the terrible policies of one of its most famous emperors, Aurangzeb. And it's very often compared to, for example, the Maurya Empire. The Maurya Empire is seen as being far more conducive to modern political narratives because it's not ruled ostensibly, it's not ruled by religious fanatics, at least, differing in one specific Mughal emperor here. And it's also seen as being more indigenous and more Indian in a sense. But if you really think about the structure of the Mauryan state, we're looking at a time when India is nowhere near as populous as it is today, where the vast majority of the population is concentrated in the Gangetic Plains. And more importantly, there isn't really a lot of evidence to show that outside of the Gangetic Plains, the Mauryan Empire was any more benevolent towards its subjects than the Mughal Empire was. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence showing that the Mauryas didn't really have a lot of control beyond the main Gangetic Plains themselves. We know, for example, that during the reign of Bindusara, the second Mauryan emperor, that there were already rebellions happening in Takshashila, for example, which is how his son Ashoka began to make his name. So if you're talking about the biggest empires, then I really think the Mughals need to come in for a more serious conversation. As I mentioned a little earlier, Aurangzeb, due to some of his temple destroying activities, or due to his perceived hostility towards Hindus, it's kind of anathema to really talk about the Mughals as a truly Indian empire. But if you think about the way that the Mughals did art, for example, if you think about their sense of fashion, if you think about the fact that they were constantly trying to commission Sanskrit works, that Aurangzeb's close relatives, including his brother Dara Shikoh, tried to translate the Upanishads into Persian and that kind of stuff, you start to realize that the Mughals were, in a lot of ways, a profoundly Indian empire. The version of Islam that they propagated, generally speaking, was something that was surprisingly Indian. Like to this day, for example, there are Muslim communities in Banaras who will go and pray to the river Ganga. You can't imagine that a Muslim community in, for example, Saudi Arabia would do something like that. It just goes to show you that every religion that has come into India has kind of become a very much Indian kind of religion. And the same happens to dynasties that come into India as well. It happened with the Kushanas, it happened with the Hunas, and in more recent history, it happened with the Mughals. So yeah, that's a long and short answer. It was the Mughal Empire that was the largest empire.
One question, Anirudh, that you were talking about Persian Empire, and I have read in some places that there is an amalgamation of Greek and Indian culture, as well as there is a lot of influence of Persian culture over Indian subcontinent. And I was just watching a documentary, or was it a vlog? And in that, I came to know that the word "gau" itself is coming from Persia, because in India it must be dhenu. Dhenu is the actual Indian word or Sanskrit word.
Sanskrit word.
But "gau" is like a Persian word. So, how did it start? This all Greek thing with India. There, I have seen so many relations. There is one more relation with Israel. I think there were 7 kings who went in Israel to save someone or something like that. I have just a fleeting information regarding that. So if you know, can you tie up these 4 people, India, Israel, Greece, Persia? So
yeah, absolutely. So I think that in order to do that, we have to actually go pretty far back in time. And I think that, quite frankly, India's interaction with its broader neighborhood is something that really needs to be understood. India is not an island, after all. India has been profoundly impacted by what happens in all of its neighboring regions. So we're not just looking at Persia. We should also look at, for example, Southeast Asia. We should look at the Himalayan regions. We'll be looking at Central Asia. All of these regions have interacted with India at a very profound and fundamental level. And through many, many centuries, India has impacted the culture of these regions, just as the culture of these regions has come and impacted India. Now, the case of Iran is particularly interesting. So, in an earlier answer, you guys had asked about what I think about the Indo-Aryan migration hypothesis. And I said that there is a lot of evidence supporting this. And I also mentioned the fact that, for example, the Zoroastrians of early Persia they mention a drug called haoma, which is probably cognate with the Sanskrit word soma, which is mentioned in the Rig Veda. Now, the thing is that you basically have a Central Asian people who are called the Indo-Europeans, who split into multiple branches as they're migrating all across the world in the late Bronze Age. So there's a branch of them that comes into Iran, those are called the Indo-Iranians, and there's a branch of them that comes into India, those are called the Indo-Aryans. Now, over many, many centuries, it's really fascinating that both the Indo-Iranians and the Indo-Aryans become part of their lands that they arrive in, profoundly shape its culture, interact with the indigenous cultures that are there. And in turn, because these regions that they live in are so connected to the rest of the world, if you look at India, for example, you have this constant procession of people coming in from Central Asia, right? You have the Shakas, the Indo-Scythians, you have the Indo-Parthians, you have the Indo-Greeks, you have the Kushanas, you have the Hunas, and then you have the Turks, you have the Timurids, you even have the Mongols at various points. And as they're all coming, they're constantly adding new stuff to Indian culture. The same thing is actually happening with Persia as well, right? So our distant relations, the Indo-Iranians, they're also having these many, many Central Asian tribes who are coming and conquering them, settling down there. Later on, you have the Arabs who come in roughly in the 8th century. And if you look at the Abbasid Caliphate, right? So very often the Abbasid Caliphate is thought of as a profoundly Arab empire, but it's really not. It's really a very Persian and really almost a Roman empire in some ways. Right? It really draws on the legacy of both those ancient imperial traditions. And as a result, you essentially see this thing called the a Persian cosmopolis emerging, which is this vast intellectual world that spreads all the way from Spain, according to some definitions, to Iran. And where you have this vast intellectual and cultural world that is mostly communicating in Persian that emerges. And similarly, in the Indian subcontinent at the same time, you see a Sanskrit cosmopolis emerging, where the entire Indian subcontinent, as well as vast regions of Southeast Asia, are also engaging in an intellectual world and a cultural world that communicates through Sanskrit. And then facilitated by the movements of the Turks in roughly the 12th, 13th centuries, these two worlds collide. And like initially, it's a violent collision. All of us know the violent stories of the establishment of the Delhi Sultanate, for example. But very soon, and keep in mind, you have these oceans are related, right? They originate from two branches of the same people, and they've developed in contact, but not in complete interaction for thousands of years. And then they kind of smash together into this vast Persianate cosmopolis. And you see this beautiful flowering of Persian culture, language, all that stuff happening within India. And to me at least, I think that's one of the richest legacies that our ancestors have left us. This deep legacy of interaction and of taking influences from all over the world and making them profoundly Indian. Right? Some of the traditional handicrafts of Varanasi, one of the most sacred sites in Hinduism, are actually deeply shaped by Muslim artisans who have immigrated from Central Asia or from Iran many, many centuries ago and have just become profoundly Indian in so many ways. I can point to communities all across southern India where you have Muslim communities that have come along the coast, that have come along with sultans, that have been attracted by the offers of Indian courts to come and work with them, and who have formed their own communities and who will speak the local language and in every way are Indian Muslims. And this actually ties into your question about Israelis and Jews as well, because just as Muslims have come to India's coast, primarily if you look at the 8th century, within the 7th, 8th centuries, within the lifetime of the Prophet Muhammad himself, you have Muslim traders who are coming and settling down Kerala, for example. And this is actually roughly the same time as Shaivism or Bhakti Shaivism is emerging in Tamil Nadu. Now, Bhakti Shaivism is always considered to be a very Indian thing, but we have proof that Muslims have been living peacefully on India's shores for as long as Bhakti-based Shaivism has existed. So why is it that Islam is considered a foreign religion? There have been Indians who have been following it for more than 1,000 years. And just as there have been Indian Muslims for all this time, there have also been Indian Jews. There have been Indian Christians. There have been Indian Parsis. All of them have been coming as traders. They've settled down along India's coast. They have brought their own traditions. They've brought their own gods. And they have been welcomed by Indian rulers throughout centuries. There's so many examples from across southern India. You look at Gujarat, you look at Maharashtra, you look at Karnataka, you look at Kerala, you look at Tamil Nadu, you look at Andhra Pradesh, and I can give you examples of kings ensuring that Muslim merchants come and settle down, encouraging them to set up mosques, encourage them to intermarry with locals, and those guys basically being happy to do that and settling down and becoming part of Indian trade guilds, helping facilitate India's interaction with the broader Mediterranean world and all that. So yeah, it's a very complex, very interconnected history that we are the inheritors of. It is not that India belongs to any one particular religion, any one particular language. People from all over the world have been settling down here for hundreds of years, and all of them have added a lot of valuable stuff to the tapestry that is our shared heritage.
While you were saying that every trader from other parts of the Middle East and from the far west, or even from South India, even they went to South India. But I was meanwhile also thinking that I have been to many countries in Europe, and there I also see that there were traders. For example, there were German traders, there were Portugal traders, there were Spanish traders, and so on. And never in any country I saw that a culture got influenced or assimilated so well that it became a new culture altogether. So if I go in East bloc of Europe, there I will see that, okay, this restaurant was made by the German traders, or this monastery was made by the German traders, and so on and so forth. And it's still segregated. You do not see that the culture, obviously a little bit of food, that, for example, the pork is so famous now in East Europe that they love it more than the Germans, who are like famous for their Frankfurter. So why is it that only in India I see this kind of mixing so well and making a new culture out of it altogether? What is it? Was it that after Ashoka we tried to start accepting everyone, or not we, I mean the people who were at that time living in the Indian subcontinent? Were they trying to accept everyone? Was it because of Buddhism, or was it something else altogether?
So I think there's a very complicated set of processes happening, and I think they're actually far older than Ashoka himself. If you look at the corpus of Vedic literature, and if you see the Upanishads, you see the Brahmanas, you'll see a lot of very interesting hints that the Indo-Aryans were actually trying to interact with and trying to assimilate the existing groups that they found in the Indian subcontinent. So the Rig Veda, for example, is a very interesting document in that sense, because it mentions people called the Dasas. And the Indo-Aryans, the Aryas who are composing the Vedas, obviously have a very complicated relationship with the Dasas. On the one hand, they will ask Indra to bless their weapons and to destroy the weapons of the Dasas and to destroy their towns and cities so they can conquer them. And on the other hand, there will also be verses praising the Dasas for being high and haughty, and like the Aryans are evidently like quite impressed by these people who they are. So there seems to have been a process of a very deep cultural interaction between both these cultures. The Aryas, as I mentioned, they are pastoral people. They are just going around herding their cattle. In fact, the Sanskrit, or at least the Rig Vedic term that they use for battle is, I think it's called Gavikshi, which means something on the lines of desire for cows or something like that. But by the late Vedic period, they're all farmers, and they're all interested in like getting as much farmland as they possibly can from kings and that kind of thing. Now, that shows you that they've obviously looked at the economies and societies of the indigenous people and their technologies and have kind of adapted them. So, from a very early period, you're seeing this process where cultures in the subcontinent initially clash a little bit, but then figure out ways to kind of coexist and kind of interact and just become kind of the one same culture. And the Aryas are actually especially interesting because a lot of historians believe that they didn't actually like wipe out the Dasas in any like meaningful sense, because, and we can see it in our own DNA, right? We can see it from roughly 1200 BC. We see that Central Asian genes start to enter the overall Indian gene pool, but the Indian gene pool itself like stays more or less the same after these people come in. And it's quite possible that the Dasas actually became a part of the Aryan culture themselves. That you would have had Dasa lords and kings who became Aryan Kshatriyas. You would have had Dasa religious leaders who became part of the Arya Brahmanical culture. And the reason we know this is because we have examples of state formation from medieval South India, where this Sanskritic court culture and this culture of building temples and of Puranic Hinduism is coming to South India for the first time. And there are some kings who are propagating it, and they're very often fighting against indigenous peoples. And these indigenous peoples are incorporated into the system by giving their priests Brahmin status, by giving their nobles and their chiefs Kshatriya status. And the caste system, I mean, let's not like mince words. The caste system is a profoundly brutal and exploitative system. And to this day, it treats people at the lowest rungs of the ladder like absolute crap. Like it's shameful that in any developed country that people are still being used to manually clean sewers and who are constantly dying without even like acknowledgement from the media and the government system. But at the same time, the caste system allows the incorporation, assimilation of many, many different groups by assigning them different statuses within this rung with, the Brahmins at the top and these various other cultures along there. I think that's potentially one very big reason, because everybody is able to get along because everybody knows what their status is. And once a particular occupational group or a particular lineage group gets that recognition from other groups that are there, once they know where they fit into the overall hierarchy, they do move up and down over centuries. But that identity that is there, that presence that they have within an Indian system, I think allows them to maintain a little bit of their original culture while also assimilating to a great extent to the cultures they find around.
And when I compare to I'm just talking about Persians now because I do not know much about Greeks, and I do not know anything about Israelis in those times. But when I see Persians and when I see the Indian culture, the only similar food I see is that we use that flat bread which we call roti, and our food also contains a lot of spices. But I think it maybe indigenously started from South India, not from someone outside of India, and that's why India was a spice hub once upon a time. And when people try to explain it that this is how it started and this is how it propagated, and that's why as you go towards east, the food becomes blander and blander because the weather becomes colder and colder, and Iran is quite cold as compared to Indian subcontinent. So these all different theories, it confuses me a lot. And now I want to know that whatever theory you are saying and whatever theories those some of those Indian historians are telling, I am an engineer, and whenever we publish a paper, it was first reviewed by our seniors, then it is peer reviewed, and then after it is published. And even after publishing, if you get some questions or if you get some opposition, then probably you have to retract that paper after some times. So why are these theories, if the theory which you are saying it is correct, then why the other theories are still out there? And if the other theories are correct, then why these theories are still out there? Why is there a Venn diagram where there is a gray area? And is there something which is not yet proven? That's why it is there.
Well, actually, like I said, I think the evidence is pretty conclusive because, again, you're an engineer, you understand how this is done. The genetic evidence was done extremely scientifically. It has been peer-reviewed by a whole bunch of people over multiple decades. It's been published in the most reputable scientific journals. So, at least in that sense, I'm sure that you'll agree that the genetic evidence is probably rock solid. When it comes to the other stuff, the thing is, like I said, there are always people who want to convince you about a particular way of thinking. And these are people who usually have access to publishers without going through the process of peer review, who are able to put up blogs and blogs are obviously not going to be peer reviewed. And because there are a lot of people who agree with them, their ideas become amplified. And because their ideas are amplified and because a lot of people want to believe in them, they come to be accepted as truth. But if you want to go by the peer-reviewed route, then I can absolutely tell you that the Aryan migration theory is the one that has the weight of evidence, the weight of scholarship, the weight of expertise on it. There are a lot of people online who will cherry pick various evidence and say that this is the linguistic evidence, this is the food evidence, but the methodologies are very questionable. Now, I'm not a linguist myself, so like I can't point to exact mistakes in the linguistic inferences, but I'm sure there are people who have. There's this very interesting subreddit called Our Indo-European, if you're interested, which usually focuses on like academic understanding of this whole thing that happened, and they provide excellent references. But when it comes to food, especially, right? I mean, I feel like food is something that is very integrally tied to culture. And the culture that India and Persia have today is hugely different from the culture it would have had like 3,000-4,000 years ago. Like the entire structure of the economy has changed. Like when have India and Persia 3,000-4,000 years ago were nowhere near as urbanized, nowhere near as populous. They didn't have these sophisticated courtly cultures, languages, global trade connections back then that they have today. And all these things profoundly influence the way that cuisines develop. So if you're going to infer like such ancient historical trends from evidence based on food, then you have to be very, very critical. You have to use a lot of evidence over many, many centuries to kind of trace that thread down. And I personally don't think that the records that we have of ancient and medieval food habits are comprehensive enough to come to anything of that kind of conclusion. So the food and linguistic evidence, methodologically questionable. The archaeological evidence, the genetic evidence, and the linguistic evidence, at least in a strictly scientific, peer-reviewed fashion, all leans towards the hypothesis that I'm presenting.
Tell me that how important is archaeology in our historical studies, and what is the current situation of archaeological studies in India?
So archaeology is integral to like any sensible reconstruction of history, but India, sadly enough, like hasn't done a lot of good archaeology, which is another reason why really questionable history takes have been floating around for a lot of time. And like, let's be clear, like both the left wing and the right wing do this. One of the most influential left-wing interpretations of medieval history was the idea of an urban decay. So this was based on like a very selective kind of archaeology that was done. They looked at a few coins that were found mostly in North India. They looked at like a few inscriptional sources. They looked at some textual sources. And there was this theory that basically in the ancient period, like leading up to the Gupta period, that cities were growing across the subcontinent. Then through the medieval period, cities kind of just faded away and people were living mostly in villages, that people weren't indulging in trade, that people didn't know what currency was, all these things. And that all changed only after the Delhi Sultanate was established. Now, you will not believe it, but this theory kind of held sway in Indian academia for nearly 20 to 30 years. But now, based on overwhelming amounts of like archaeological evidence is slowly coming up and new discoveries of coins. For example, there are some really fascinating coins from Maharashtra of the Rashtrakuta Empire, which are golden coins, which show these designs that look almost like Arabic, but obviously not Arabic. They don't make any sense. But they're just like these nice squiggly lines with dots on them. So clearly showing the Rashtrakutas were trading with the Arabs, and they found the Arabic script beautiful enough that they wanted to use it as a decorative motif on their coins. That's such a ringing endorsement that medieval Indians did indulge in global trade. And new reviews of literature have shown us that no, that is the opposite that's the case. Cities are actually growing. India is urbanizing during this time, especially along the East Coast because of international trade. We see what's called the third urbanization, where huge new like temple towns are emerging like all across the Tamil coast, reaching all the way up to Odisha in some cases. So without archaeology, you cannot build a full picture of the past. India has been sadly too reliant on texts as sources of history. But the more archaeology we do, the more we can understand about the structures of states and societies, the kind of daily lives, the kind of material conditions that people lived in. Unfortunately, in India today, like it's mostly North India that gets the funding for archaeology. We know the shapes and the contours of many ancient North Indian towns, such as, for example, Koshambi, Vaishali, Ujjain. All of them have had great archaeology done. But in comparison, in South India, like there's been barely any archaeology for the great cities of Kalyana, Warangal, Manyakheta. Like we're not even sure where exactly Manyakheta, the capital of the Rashtrakuta Empire, exactly was. And we haven't found any remnants of it. Like if only there was funding for this kind of thing, we could build a much better, much more well-rounded understanding of who we are and where we come from. But the thing is that very often archaeological conclusions can fly in the face of reigning political narratives. And as long as the government retains funding over archaeology, as long as archaeologists and historians are worried about government or political backlash for coming up with new facts, Indian history is going to stagnate. It's very important today that we encourage these hard facts about history to come out, and more importantly, encourage Indian society to kind of reach the maturity to have conversations about our past. Because once we're able to do that, then look at the way that Europe, for example, deals with their history, right? Europe has fantastic museums. They even preserve buildings from the 1980s as objects of artistic and cultural heritage. Whereas in India, you have cities, temples, shrines that have been around for thousands of years, that are older than the United States of America, and get like zero funding for preservation. And the reason why Europe is able to do this is because they took the time and they funded the historians who built up the corpus of facts, which enables media ecosystems to come up and monetize the facts that come out. But in India, how many good Indian produced documentaries on Indian history can you guys make? There aren't a lot. No. I was so shocked that I was the first Indian podcaster to talk about Indian history, because it's just not realistic as a career path. There needs to be funding for this. There needs to be entire academic ecosystems, commercial ecosystems that come around. That's the only way that we can even begin to do justice to our historical legacy.
After Ashoka, there is a big gap, and then there is Mughal Empire. And when I literally searched these keywords, and I found a thing called Mahajanpadas. What is this Mahajanpada, and why didn't we hear it in our history books?
So the Mahajanpadas are basically a series of large kingdoms that emerged in the late Vedic period and continued to the early historic period. And Mahajanpadas such as Magadha, for example, evolved complex bureaucracies, large armies, and so on, and in a lot of ways, they're the direct precedent of the modern empire. The modern empire is not, it doesn't appear out of the blue. It's the result of many centuries of state formation, empire building in the Gangetic Plains. And in that sense, the modern empire is really the first Gangetic empire, not really the first subcontinental empire, it is very often claimed to be. And I don't think that it's correct that the Mughal Empire is the first major empire after the Mauryas. There are many, many Indian empires that come up in the interim that are extremely complex, that have populations that are probably larger than the Mauryan scale in its heyday, because again, the population of India is constantly growing through many, many centuries. So you can look at the Rashtrakuta Empire, the Kalyana Chalukya Empire. In South India, you can look at the Chola Empire. Even North India, you can look at the Pratihara Empire, you can look at the Pala Empire. Moving beyond India's shores, you can look at the Tibetan Empire, you can look at the Khmer Empire. Within this broader Indosphere, as it's sometimes called, you have a great deal of like very interesting qualities that come up. But sadly, because we want to have histories that support our idea of India as a single united land or whatever, it's only the Mauryas and the Mughals that get this attention because they apparently had subcontinent spanning extent. But like I said in the beginning of like the second round of the podcast, it's really only the Mughals who can claim to be truly subcontinental in that sense. Mauryan control, they did control most of the Gangetic Plains, but how much control they had in the Deccan, for example, in the northwest, even in Kalinga, to say nothing of like South India, like Tamil Nadu, Kerala, like these are the states that are like roughly the size of like Spain and Portugal. And the Mauryas definitely didn't control that. So yeah, I think that answers your question.
Can you, before going, can you share some story or some information which we all don't know, and probably it is most interesting for all of us to hear from you?
Well, we've talked a lot about ancient India through this podcast, but I think that medieval India definitely needs to get more attention because it's such a fascinating place, wherein a lot of the things that we associate most with Indianness really emerge. The idea that there are Jyotirlinga sites across the subcontinent, the idea that there are Shakta worship sites across the subcontinent, the idea that you can go and bathe in tirthas and cleanse your sins at tirthas is something that emerges during this time. And also some of the most famous temples that we know of today are also built in the medieval period. So in general, the medieval period needs a lot more attention. There's this weird kind of like gap in our cultural memory. And I think that's partially because of our school syllabi, right? You learn about the Mauryas, then you like skip about 500 years and you learn about the Guptas, then you skip another like few hundred years and you arrive at the Delhi Sultanate. But the period between the Guptas and the Delhi Sultanate is actually the most fascinating, innovative time in India's entire history, to me at least. Mm-hmm. So if you look at medieval India, you see a lot of things that also defy our understanding of like how India is today. So one especially interesting thing, I posted this on my Instagram recently, is there's this dynasty in Odisha called the Bhaumakaras. And the Bhaumakaras are unique, not just in India, but I think also globally in some senses, because there are 6 reigning queens who rule in their own name during the Bhaumakara dynasty. And of those 6, the last 4 of them are actually direct successors of each other. And that's very interesting. I don't think we generally know of like any other place in the world where this is happening. And there are a bunch of very unique factors that led into this taking place. The Bhaumakaras are actually originally from Assam, and they served as generals and warriors under this king called Shashanka of Gauda in the 7th century. So anybody who's heard of Harshavardhana of Kannauj would know who Shashanka is. Shashanka was Harsha's great rival. And after Shashanka's death, these guys who come from Assam originally somehow like everybody who served Shashanka is fighting for slice of his empire. And these guys, the Bhaumas, who are from Assam originally, end up in Odisha and they carve out a little kingdom along the shores of the Mahanadi River. And that's how they initially start off. And like initially you can see in their temples, they're very much of a Pala and a Buddhist influence because they're right next to Bengal, of course. But gradually they start to interact with the indigenous deities of the land, especially the Adivasi mother goddesses. And you start to see a presence of yogini worship, especially tantric yogini worship across this region. And it seems just generally that because the Bhaumas intermarried very deeply with Adivasi tribes, that women just generally had more of a space in the Bhauma kingdom than other places. So there's a bit of a political crisis that happens in 9th century which is the result of the clashing of like two very interesting medieval empires, which I don't really have the time to get into right now. And what happens is that as a result of that crisis, a queen rises to the throne as a regent for her grandson. And she actually built some of the earliest temples in modern Bhubaneswar today. And another couple of generations later, there's a similar political crisis. Another queen comes to the throne. Another generation later, there's another bunch of queens who come to the throne. They're by far the most interesting to me because there's a mother who, again, like she's not part of the Bhama dynasty. She marries into it, but she acts as a regent for her daughter. Then her daughter is the last powerful king or queen of the Bhama dynasty. Then she's succeeded by her stepmother, and the stepmother is finally succeeded by another like female relative of hers who's married to another Bhama king. So you basically have a situation where there's a harem within the palace of powerful women, and they're all passing the throne back and forth between each other because they see themselves as the best candidates to rule. And they are deliberately sidelining men because there are either no men or the men are not capable enough to rise to the throne. And they maintain the dynasty's independence for as long as they possibly can before eventually being wiped out by a much more powerful dynasty called the Sumavamshis. Now, you've heard of, Chand Bibi, you've heard of Noor Jahan, you've heard of Rani Lakshmibai. You hear of all these much more recent Indian queens who are remarkable characters in their own right. But it's important to recognize that women have always played a very important role in Indian history. And especially in the medieval period, they were integral to the way that states and empires functioned. And the understanding that we generally have of Indian history is very male-centric. It's all about this king, that king, this king so amazing, that king so amazing, this king fought so many battles, that king fought so many battles. But queens also played a very important role behind the scenes. Just because they don't leave as much of a historical trace as the kings doesn't mean that they didn't leave a trace. And absolutely recommend to all of your listeners that if they're interested, they should read more about the Bhama queens of Odisha.
Can you suggest us some website or some books if you can that we can read, because this I have never heard of?
Yep. Devika Rangachari has a fascinating book called From Obscurity to Light, Women in Early Medieval Odisha from the 7th to the 12th century. So I should generally recommend anything by Devika Rangachari. She has some of the most interesting work I've come across on medieval Indian women. So highly recommend.
Thank you. And before we go, tell us viewers about your new podcast and all other blogs which you write. I will also share your website link because it is pretty interesting stuff there. So just you can, if you want, you can tell you about your podcast.
Sure. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, I host two podcasts. They're called Echoes of India and Yuddha. Echoes of India is going to be starting again from July, hopefully. And we're actually going to have a season that's specifically about ancient India and the emergence of the Mahajanapadas and the empires of the Gangetic Plains. And we're going to have a very interesting kind of bottom-up perspective. We'll try to understand how did the lives of the common people change over all this time. And we're especially going to spend a lot of time talking about Buddha, Mahavira, and all the philosophical movements of this time, and how in a lot of ways these new ideas that come up in the late Vedic / early historic periods are the direct ancestors of a lot of the ideas that we are familiar with to this day. From Karman, Atman, rebirth and all that, this is really when they take solid form and shape. So it's a really interesting time for anybody who's interested in ancient India to try to understand. Aside from that, I also host a YouTube channel called Connected Histories. That's basically a platform which tries to explore history of the world, but with South Asia and the Indian subcontinent at the center. So we talk a lot about trade that happened across the Indian Ocean. We have two videos up so far. One is on the Battle of Talikota in the 16th century, which led to the collapse of the city of Vijayanagara. And we have another video on medieval automata. So basically these very complex water-powered devices that existed in the 10th century in India as well as in Greece and in Iraq. Aside from that, working on a book about the medieval Deccan. Like I said, the medieval period is absolutely fascinating, the time between the Gupta Empire and the Delhi Sultanate. And it teaches a lot about Indianness in a lot of ways. And especially because my book is set in the Deccan, so it's about southern India really, which is something that is generally not talked about a lot when it comes to India's imperial histories. That's one project I'm working on. And of course, I have a whole bunch of other stuff happening might be publishing a book with Penguin Random House in a couple of years and so on. And I could just go on. I'm just going to stop here.
No. I want you to go on for long, at least for another 50 years, because I have heard mostly all of your Yuddha series till now, and it is pretty interesting. And I would suggest everyone to go to your website, and you can directly hear it from there, and also read your blogs, because some of your write-ups are quite interesting, and I have never seen history shown that way before also. And as I said, that your writing is quite nuanced. You go into some very specific things and you elaborate it like I have never read before. So kudos to you, and all the best for your future books, and may you write many more books. And yeah, I will be waiting for that, and hope to see you again very soon when then we will talk about something else, because this time we were like kids and we were just want to understand what basic history is. I mean, Abhimanyu can also say the same thing, that we have talked about history after I think 10-15 years with someone who is telling us real information. So thank you very much.
Exactly. After graduation and working in the industry, it's been long. We have touched the history, and then I was going through his podcast and the videos. Those are quite interesting, and it are very up to the points. I mean, I was going through few of your podcasts, so it is quite interesting, and I would suggest our viewers also to watch it. And we are looking forward again to call you on some specific topic where we can discuss furthermore. So thanks.
Looking forward to it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anirudh. Thank you very much for coming. And yeah, bye-bye, everyone. Thank you.
See you.
Check the mic and make sure it sound right, boys.